Good afternoon. My name is Don Wolfensberger, Director of the Congress Project. I want to welcome you to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars on behalf of our President and Director, Lee Hamilton. We're pleased to be co-sponsoring today's program with our Division of International Security Studies, whose director is Rob Litvak, and I want to thank Rob and his staff for their cooperation and sharing their mailing list. We're also pleased to have the support of Chevron, which has provided us with a nice grant each year to partially support our seminar series. Before we proceed with introducing today's program, let me just say a few things about the Wilson Center for those of you who are newcomers here. Back in 1968, Congress created the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars as a living memorial to our 28th president. And Woodrow Wilson is still to date the only president to have earned a Ph.D. As you may know, before he ran for governor of New Jersey in 1910 and then president of the United States in 1912, he was a teacher of history and government in a number of colleges and universities, and then became president of Princeton University. So he was a great believer, though, that if you bring the scholars and the policymakers into the same room, the thinkers and the doers, that both would benefit from that exchange of views on issues of the day. And that's really what the Wilson Center is about, and that in Wilson's spirit, we have about 800 meetings a year in which we bring together members of Congress, executive branch officials, judicial branch officials, businessmen, scholars. We have people from all walks of life that come through these doors and exchange views on a variety of issues, both domestic and international. And the Congress Project was created in 1999 with that same spirit in mind, where we bring together members of Congress, scholars who write about Congress, journalists that cover Capitol Hill, and we talk about the policy process on the Hill, how Congress really makes policy, what are the politics that go into making public policy. And I think, as you'll see today, as an example of that. This ends a two-year series that we have been having that was organized around the election, the 2008 presidential election, and the series was entitled The President and Congress, Politics, Policy, and Governance. And today's program is the last of that two-year series, and as you know, the title of today's program is Congress's Role in Foreign Policy Making. As I was mentioning to some of our panelists just before the program, I think if you ask many Americans, they would think that foreign policy is sort of the exclusive domain of the President of the United States. If Congress gets involved, they're just being an annoyance, a disturbance, a disruption. They're sending mixed messages to folks abroad and so on. And few people really understand the way that our system was set up. A few people that maybe took a little time think, all right, we'll give you the Senate is involved somehow too. I mean, they approve ambassadors, they ratify treaties, so we'll give you a little bit of interference there with the Senate. But not a lot of people think about the entire Congress being involved in such a variety of ways. And yet I think if you look at the Constitution, you'll see that Congress not only declares wars, but it regulates trade among nations. It sets the rules for piracies and felonies on the high seas and offenses against the laws of nations. It sets tariffs and duties, and it appropriates money for the conduct of our nation's foreign policy, and that's a really big one, as we'll find out later as our program goes along. It seems to me that there can be no question that since the emergence of the modern presidency at the beginning of the last century, there's no doubt that the president is the lead person on foreign policy matters. He speaks for the nation, he negotiates for it with other governments, has the power to recognize or not recognize other countries and receive their ambassadors, and certainly is at the helm as commander-in-chief when America is at war. But as constitutional scholar Edward Corwin has put it, I think so eloquently, the Constitution is an invitation to struggle for the privilege of directing America's foreign policy. And I think we see that struggle daily between the branches in small ways and large ways. Today we're privileged to have two distinguished members of the House of Representatives to lead off our seminar and talk a little bit about their perspectives and experiences on Congress's role in foreign policy making. We have always offered this format to members of the Hill because they have to get back for votes this evening, and that is that they will speak for the part of the first hour, and then we'll have some questions from our panelists to them, and then questions from our audience, and then they will be able to depart. In our second hour, we will hear from our scholar, Chris Deering, and our journalist, Karen DeYoung of the Washington Post. So that is the way we are designing it. Let me remind you before I forget as well that after this program at 5 o'clock, there will be a small wine and cheese reception in the Moynihan Boardroom, which is just across the hallway, to which you're all invited so that we can carry on our conversations informally on the topic and any other topic you may wish. It might be the Capitals hockey team, who knows. Let me now introduce our two lead-off speakers. Speaking first will be Congressman Chris Van Hollen, who's a Democratic member representing the 8th Congressional District of Maryland. He's only in his 4th term in the House, and yet has risen very rapidly in the ranks. He's now an assistant to Speaker Nancy Pelosi. He's chairman of his party's Congressional Campaign Committee in the House. He's a member of the powerful House Ways and Means Committee that deals with trade, taxes, Social Security, Medicare, just to name a few. And I believe you're also on the Oversight and Government Reform Committee, on their subcommittee on national security and foreign affairs. So he's got a breadth of committee assignments and responsibilities there. Prior to coming to the Congress, he was 12 years in the Maryland General Assembly, and prior to that, he worked as a staff member for Senator Charles McMathias of Maryland, and then for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He was born in Pakistan, by the way, the son of a Foreign Service officer and a distinguished ambassador, so you might say he really does have foreign policy in his blood. Congressman Frank Wolf is a Republican member representing the 10th Congressional District of Virginia. One of the ways we were able to snag these fellows is they're just nearby, so it wasn't as much of a travel problem for them as our members that are from California or elsewhere, but we appreciate them both taking the time out of their day to be here. Congressman Wolf was first elected to the House in 1980, and he has risen in the ranks in the House Appropriations Committee, where he's currently the senior Republican, the ranking Republican on the Subcommittee on Commerce, Justice, and Science. In the last Congress, he was the senior Republican on the Subcommittee on State and Foreign Operations. He, too, got his start on the Hill as a staff member to a congressman. I think it was it Pete Beester of Pennsylvania. And then he moved on to jobs in the Department of Interior under, I believe it was Rogers Morton. Congressman Wolf has been especially active on a variety of human rights issues, as you may know, from Darfur to China. He's living proof, I think, that individuals can have and make an impact on our country's foreign policies. With that, let me turn the program over to Congressman Chris Van Hollen.
Thank you, Don. Thank you, Don. Thank you. Well, thank you, Don. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you for your work and your book, which I plan to read and would recommend it to anybody after we read it. And he's done a lot of work, Don, on the Hill. It's great to be here at the Wilson Center. And, of course, Lee Hamilton, who heads the center, has written a lot on the subject of the Congress and foreign policy. And it's humbling to be here to be talking about that subject when Lee has done so much work in that area. It's great to be here with my colleague Frank Wolf, who, as Don said in his introduction, has been a practitioner of the art of legislation and foreign policy for many years and has been a leading voice in our country on human rights and so many other issues. It's great to be with you, Frank. And as well with Chris Deering of George Washington University, and look forward to being joined by Karen. Much has been said on this topic and written, and so I'm not going to go over to your relief, I think, the whole history of Congress and foreign policy making. What I thought I would do is look at some of the ways Congress has asserted itself in the foreign policy arena, some current examples of that, and then try to anticipate those areas where we expect Congress to be more assertive or less assertive in the days ahead. And as Don said, while the President is the primary actor in the area of foreign policy, the field of play, the shape of the field upon which the President acts, is in many ways shaped by what Congress does in this area. And while the President can, of course, deploy ships in certain places or instruct our ambassadors or envoys to deliver certain messages, the fact of the matter is Congress has and will continue to help shape the scope of that action and provide certain limitations in some cases on the scope of that conduct. Obviously, one of the main powers Congress has is the power to declare war. I'm not going to go into great detail on that because my understanding is you've covered that in previous seminars, but all of you know that is a very active area of debate. The war powers, Congress after the Vietnam War, of course, passed the war powers resolution over a presidential veto, and that continues to be an area where Congress and the President compete for exactly what their powers may be. So what I want to do is just run down some of the instruments that the Congress uses to leverage foreign policy, some of the levers that we use, and then apply some examples going forward. Clearly, the Senate's power to confirm high-level foreign policy nominees is one of those powers. We've seen that in use recently when Senator Brownback of Kansas held up the appointment of Chris Hill for a period of time, complaining that Chris Hill hadn't done enough in the area of human rights when he was our envoy with respect to North Korea. Chris Hill's nomination obviously cleared, but it was one minor skirmish and a recent example of use of that power. Of course, we've seen it in much greater use in other instances. Jesse Helms, when he was on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, used to employ it frequently, and as a staff member there, he used to employ it both against the Clinton administration as well as against the Reagan administration. Governor Weld of Massachusetts, of course, was nominated by President Clinton to be our ambassador to Mexico, and Senator Helms have just prevented that nomination from coming to the floor. When Reagan was president, he delayed many of the nominees in Africa, Assistant Secretary for African Affairs and our ambassador to Mozambique, and used that to help leverage his position on policy issues. The Senate's power to ratify treaties, and not just to ratify them, but to put reservations and amendments and modifications on those treaties, and I'll just give you some examples in a minute. Congress can legislate directly on any particular issue. That can be a challenge to the extent that the Congress is in conflict with the President. Why? Because the President, of course, can veto any bill passed by the United States Congress, which requires a supermajority of Congress to overcome that veto. And that's why you more often see the device of legislating applied in the context of appropriations bills, and Frank is on the Appropriations Committee, because if a president decides to veto an appropriations bill that has a limitation on it or a direction on how to use money, the president, of course, has to veto the entire appropriations bill, cannot go in and line item veto a particular provision, which means it sets up a little bit of a game of chicken in that particular context. And then finally, oversight. Now, I mentioned that last, but it's a very important part of the congressional powers, and in fact, it's one that Lee Hamilton exercised very well. I think he's probably a great example of how best to exercise congressional oversight, not just on a looking back basis. We often tend to have investigations and hearings to look back at things, and that's an important part of oversight, to figure out what went wrong and how to prevent it in the future, but also on an ongoing basis to hold the administration accountable, whether it's a Republican or Democratic administration. So I mentioned some examples of how the lever of the Senate approving appointees has been used. In the area of treaties, you may be surprised to learn there are 28 treaties and conventions that are currently pending before the United States Senate. The most recent one was just submitted to the Senate this past January. It has to do with an issue of double taxation between the United States and Malta. I expect that one will probably proceed fairly quickly. The earliest one, the one that was entered into the longest time ago, was the 1949 Right to Organize adopted by the International Labor Conference, and that particular treaty convention continues to be before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And so, as I say, there are 28 of them. Some of recent vintage. I served on the staff of the Foreign Relations Committee when we passed the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Force Agreement. In 1999, the Senate they voted down the ratification of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which I hope will be ratified at some point in the future. And if you look back, of course, historically, the blocking of the Versailles Treaty was an obvious example of the Senate exercising that power to block a major presidential initiative, one of Woodrow Wilson, Wilson Center, and things might have turned out differently in the out years if that had passed. We'll never know. So those are some examples of treaties that are pending. The third area I mentioned was legislation. And when it comes to trade legislation, I want to distinguish trade legislation because the Congress has special powers in those areas expressly stated in the Constitution. And we have a number of trade agreements that are pending before the Congress. I have a bill to create what we call Reconstruction Opportunity Zones in parts of Pakistan and Afghanistan. These are kind of mini free trade zones. I was very pleased that the President has adopted that as part of his what he calls his AFPAC strategy. But it's an example of something where the President needs Congress to act. I mean, the President cannot go out on his own and say, I'm going to create certain free trade zone areas in Pakistan or Afghanistan, and companies locating in those particular zones will have duty-free access for their products to the U.S. market. He doesn't have that power. He needs Congress to act on that and other trade-related agreements. It is hard to find lots of examples where the Congress has passed major legislative initiatives in the area of foreign policy that are not tied to money bills, not tied to appropriations bills, where the President resists. Because, as I said, the President can veto it, and then you're back to trying to get large supermajorities to overcome those vetoes. One important example took place in 1986. I was pleased to be on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee at that time. Senator Lugar was the Republican chairman of the committee. You had a Republican-controlled Senate, a Democratic-controlled House. The Reagan administration, President Reagan, wanted to follow a policy towards South Africa that he called constructive engagement. Many of us thought that that was not working and that we needed something a little more assertive and that we should apply sanctions on the apartheid regime in South Africa. And Congress acted on a bipartisan basis and overturned a presidential veto on a comprehensive anti-apartheid piece of legislation. Again, it's rare to find that because you do need these supermajorities to get that passed. Finally, turning to the use of appropriations, and I'm sure my colleague can mention many examples in this particular area. There are numerous examples. Just some recent examples. One is an example of someone trying to block an appropriations bill because there was funding in it, and there was, as part of the continuing resolution, there was a provision that the President supported to begin to modify our approach to Cuba. The bill allowed remittances, allowed families, Cuban-American families in the United States to send remittances to Cuba. It allowed for some family travel. It allowed for some communications exports. Bob Menendez, a senator from New Jersey, opposed that and held up for a period of time the continuing resolution, then finally relented when he thought he'd extracted some concessions going forward. You've also gotten, and I'm sure Frank Wolf will go into more detail, this in the current supplemental appropriations bill. As you all know, we've had a back and forth with respect to the issue of Guantanamo and the closing of Guantanamo. And Mr. Wolf had an amendment related to not providing funds for that purpose. David Obey, the chairman of the Appropriations Committee, also had language that is in the bill right now that provides limitations. It says the President's got to submit a report by this fall and requires the President to make a lot of certifications with respect to Guantanamo, a major policy question where Congress has clearly inserted itself in the mix through the appropriations process. The Congress, of course, can vote down a presidential request for appropriations. If you looked at the last supplemental appropriations bill that came up, you had about 50 members of the House vote against it. This was appropriations for operations in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iraq. And so, obviously the Congress can turn down an appropriations bill. Unusual to do it. It's also unusual for a president to veto one, but there's another recent example there, which is after the Congress changed hands in the 2006 election. You had in the spring of 2007 a debate on funding for the operations in Iraq. The Congress, again, the Democratic and House and Senate, applied some conditions to those funds and actually created a soft timeline for the redeployment of U.S. combat forces out of Iraq. And the President, rather than accept the money with those conditions attached, President Bush vetoed the entire supplemental appropriations bill, leaving Congress with the choice of either providing no funds to the troops or providing funds but getting rid of the conditions that had been applied. And so Congress ended up providing the funds with some other, there was some language in there, but certainly not a language that provided any significant limitations on the use of those funds. Going forward, I think you can sort of predict the areas where you're going to have Congress engaged in all these issues. Clearly, with respect to our policy toward Pakistan and Afghanistan, I think you'll see, and I hope you'll see, considerable oversight. You always have a tendency when the President's party is in power, controls the Congress, there's a tendency sometimes for reduced oversight. I believe that the period between 2000 and 2006, there was not adequate congressional oversight when you had Republican control of the House and the Senate. I hope that even though you have Democratic control of the House and the Senate now, we will have robust oversight, just as our responsibility under the Constitution as a separate branch of government. But the areas in foreign policy, again, Afghanistan, Pakistan, of course, the Middle East, and then trade policy, where Congress obviously is very engaged in the area of trade policy, and the President needs for the Congress to act in order to implement any of his trade policy going forward. So those are some of the areas. I do subscribe to Lee Hamilton's belief that we would all be better off if the executive branch consulted more with the Congress. There is, I think, and this is not something that's unique to any particular party, but I think that the executive branch sometimes gets the idea that, as Don suggests, that the American public has, that it's the exclusive player in the area of foreign policy, and they actually, learn to their chagrin that Congress does have these powers in this area, and that we'd all be better off if there was a more consultation. We may disagree at the end of the day on some of these issues, but we also might avoid some disagreements if we had more of that process going forward. So that's a brief outline of some of the levers that the Congress uses, some current application of those levers, and some of the areas where I think you'll see Congress asserting itself in the oversight area, as well perhaps as in the policy areas going forward. So thank you for having me, and I will now turn it back to Don, turn it over to Frank, whatever it is. Thank you very much.
Welcome, Karen. Thank you very much, Congressman Van Hollen. We'll turn things over to Congressman Frank Wolf.
Thank you, Don. It's good to be here, and thank all of you for coming. I'm glad to be here with Chris. We've worked together on a number of local issues, and I don't have the experience that Chris has, certainly working with the Senate. He has a different perspective. But I agreed with most of his comments, and I think the last comment he made, I think, is particularly relevant, and one that I think hopefully the Obama administration will take to heart. I doubt that it will, unless there's going to be a dramatic change, but I think it's one that every administration, Republican, Democrat, just, except for a handful, just really doesn't want the Congress to be involved, period. The Founding Fathers said that we ought to be involved, perhaps not as much as we are, but as things evolve over the years. My comments are based more on the filter that I have and the life experiences. We are all products of our life experiences. I got elected in 1980 during the Reagan years. Did not have a lot of experience. Had only been out of the country once. I'd been to Canada once. And so a lot of my perspectives have come from sort of watching different administrations and hopefully being involved in a constructive way over the last 29 years. In 1984, my good friend, one of my closest friends, Congressman Tony Hall, called me on the phone. It was on a December day, and said he had just gotten back from Ethiopia and I should go and see it. I just gotten on the Appropriations Committee, and I called Mr. Conte. I said, Mr. Conte, he was a pretty strong guy, if you knew Steele very well. I said, can I go to Ethiopia? And he finally agreed to let me go. I didn't take a staff person. I got on an airplane. I transferred in Rome. I got to Ethiopia, and I happened to get to a camp. Blaine Harden with the Washington Post covered it, and it was a life-changing experience. What I had seen was so unbelievable. People dying every day. We were up in this camp in Alamata, and I said, I'm going to spend the night. And the embassy said, you can't spend the night, this and that. And one person from World Vision said, if you spend the night, I spend the night. And that night was a life-changing experience. When I got back into town, I called Ed Meese, who happened to live in McLean, and said, can I come in to see the president to tell him about what I had just seen? This was close to Christmas. I had gotten back maybe the 18th or 17th, and you know, Washington, the town is emptying out. Ed Meese set up an appointment for me to come in and meet with the president, and I just try to recollect as I was writing this over the weekend. President Reagan was there. Vice President Bush was there. Jim Baker was there. Ed Meese was there. Colin Powell, who I assume was the National Security Advisor, was there. Peter McPherson was there, and other people were there. I still have the picture. And they listened to me, just happened got back, and the Reagan administration moved and did some fairly impressive things with regard to the famine and the hunger in Ethiopia, because one member, Public Works Committee, just got on appropriations, Post Office and Civil Service, really cared about an issue, and they acted and they responded. In contrast, having been involved in some other issues in 1998, if you recall all the stories that went on about the terrorism in Algeria, I flew to Algeria with a staff person. We were there for about 4 or 5 days. We had a military company with us everywhere we went. About 100 and some thousand, maybe 175,000 Algerians have been killed in so far as the terrorist activity. We're flying back into the United States, and we then found that the bombing took place in Nairobi and Tanzania. A constituent from mine, and McLean, was in the bombing. The family was killed in Nairobi. I quickly put in a bill, September 9th, my anniversary, my wedding anniversary, and in it, I mentioned that Osama bin Laden lived in Sudan, and I had been in Sudan, and we needed a national commission on terror. Well, my party ridiculed me. The other party ridiculed me also. And fortunately, being on the Appropriations Committee, we were able to pass this. We set up the National Commission on Terror. It was the Bremer Commission, came out with good recommendations in the year 2000. The Clinton administration totally ignored all of the recommendations, refused to deal with it. No oversight by the Congress at all on the activity. And the same thing with the first several months of the Bush administration. They totally and completely ignored some of the recommendations in this bipartisan commission that many believe would have made the difference with regard to 9/11, but it would have made a difference. Here again, congressional involvement, both administrations, Republican, Democrat, we want no part. We don't hear what you're saying. We don't care what you're saying. And by the way, we don't think it's a problem, and we don't want to hear from you. We had the Bosnia-Kosovo issue. There was tremendous bipartisan support. I remember, I tried to find the vote today. There were 40-some Republicans that voted with the Clinton administration on lifting the arms embargo and I mean, Steny Hoyer was out in front of that, Congressman Chris Smith and myself, to lift the arms embargo to do some fairly dramatic things. There were some Republicans in the Congress who didn't want to support the president on Kosovo. I was one that did, and I think on the key vote, 42 Republicans crossed the aisle, stood with the Clinton administration, and also Secretary Albright. You could always get her on the phone. I remember once I was in, I think, Vienna, on my way into the former Yugoslavia. I used to go to Sarajevo, and at different times we were in Vukovar when the Vukovar fell, and she found that I was in the airport. and sent a staff person to find me to get on the plane to fly in with her. No Secretary of State asked some lowly congressman to go on the airplane and fly in with him. But the example of the bipartisanship and listening and really opening up led to the fact that a lot of Republicans were very, very supportive of what the president was trying to do. We now move to this time, Afghanistan. I voted for going to war in Afghanistan. I felt morally responsible that since I had voted for this, I ought to go see it. I can remember working for a congressman. You mentioned, Don, his name, Congressman Beaster, and I was a young staffer during the Vietnam War. And I said, Mr. Beaster, you ought to go to Vietnam, because if you were in Congress and you're involved in Vietnam, and everyone ought to go. And I believe Pete later did go to Vietnam, but I think I felt a moral obligation. Congressman Hall and Congressman Pitts and I tried to go. They would not allow us to go. We flew to Pakistan, got on a World Food Program, flew in there, got into Bagram Air Force Base, were picked up by an NGO and a guy with AID, and took us through, gave us housing. We got to the American Embassy before the American ambassador got to the American Embassy. And I can still remember at Bagram Air Force Base trying to speak to people, and they would not, because they say, we have been told not to talk to all of you. Here's Congressman Smith, Congressman Hall, a Democrat, Congressman Pitts, a Republican, and myself. No one wanted us to be involved. They felt we ought not be there. Iraq came. The war broke out. I was one who supported the president's efforts with regard to Iraq based on the information. I said, I want to go to Iraq to see it. They said, you can't go. And so I met an NGO in Kuwait, and we drove in and spent several days, and we would go to the military bases, and I would show my ID card and said, hi, I'm a member of Congress. And they would call us in and tell us. And all of those officers, and many of them are still in touch with my office, telling, here's what you ought to be doing, here's what you should be doing. The second time we tried to go, Chris Hayes and I tried to go, they would not let us go. And again, we went in with a private group. On the third trip, we went in and saw the conditions had changed. Had I not had the experience for the first trip to be able to have a reference point, and the second trip to have a reference point, I wouldn't have known the difference in whether it was getting worse or not on the third trip, which led to our efforts with regard to the Iraq Study Group. I agree with Chris. The Congress did not have the congressional oversight that it should have had during those period of years. I was not on a committee that had that opportunity, and I wanted to participate because I felt morally responsible for the actions that we were doing as a government, and wanted to go and see. And finally, out of frustration, offered the amendment to my committee to set up the Iraq Study Group, where we pulled together 10 people, 5 and 5, Ed Meese and Leon Panetta, of course, Lee Hamilton, who I have the greatest respect, and Jim Baker, with the idea that they would report not only to the administration, but also to the American people. That was important to do because it was important that we have congressional oversight. Yet, the administration, the executive branch, really did not want us involved at all. So Congress does have a role to play, and some members want to have more of a role, others for other reasons less so, but they do have a role. To bring us up to modern times that Chris just mentioned on Guantanamo Bay. Eric Holder has, I believe, abused the privileges of his office. I serve on the committee that has the jurisdiction over the Justice Department. We fund the Justice Department. For 6 years, I was the chairman of the committee that funded the FBI, and I think if you ask Director Mueller, we put together a number of programs. We got the National Academy of Sciences to over the National Academy of Public Administration, different groups to come in. We helped Director Mueller put together an oversight group that Chuck Robb is on, others within the FBI to kind of watch and monitor and help the FBI. And so here was an opportunity, I thought, for congressional oversight for our Congress, our committee, the Appropriation Committee, to look and see. I wrote a letter to Eric Holder on March 13th and asked him for a whole series of questions. They have not answered the letter to date. I wrote another letter on April 23rd, and with another series of letters, and they have not answered that to date. And then we've written another letter and another letter to the president asking him for a number of questions, and we again get no answers. My office, and for the last 10 days, has 7 times called Eric Holder, has called the FBI, and told Director Mueller we want to meet with the career people of the Bureau, not to find out whether we should close Guantanamo or not close Guantanamo. They're policy issues. But we're not going to certainly ask the Bureau and Department of Homeland Security and CIA those issues, but to find out the information. Who are these people? There are 2 categories. There are the Uyghurs, and the Uyghurs that have been selected, that have been picked up, that are now in Guantanamo Bay, were members of the East Turkestan Islamic movement. They've all gone through Torah board training camps. Their leader is Abdul Haq. Their leader, Abdul Haq, was been put on the terrorist list not by only the previous administration, but by Stuart Levy at the Department of Treasury last month, in this administration. And yet we have not been able to get a peep. Finally, on Friday, we got a call. They're going to let the FBI come up. The administration would have been better because other members on the other side of the aisle are having an equally difficult time trying to get any answers. The other ones are they're trying to move people like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed to places like Alexandria. And that was one of the places that they were originally looking at. Now, why Alexandria and the Southern District of New York? They had some reason initially, because the Masali case was tried there. And Abdul Rahman was tried up in New York. So they were looking. But if you just go to Alexandria and walk out of the courthouse, 50 yards across is the Westin Hotel. To the left is the new Carlisle, I think they call it the condo, and then you have the Patent and Trademark Office and the Beltway and a new ramp. So it was impossible. And all you had to do was to go down there. And we tried to talk to someone there to say, have you been down there? Have you seen? And now to say that we can handle Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, but to move Khalid Sheikh Mohammed to Alexandria or to the Southern District of New York would be a mistake. And yet Eric Holder just didn't want to talk to anybody up on Capitol Hill about this. The congressional involvement, the congressional oversight, the congressional hearings, this listening, I think would have gone a long way to solve some of the problems that I think the administration is having and will continue to have. And I just saw today that Senator Webb just came out and said that he does not want these detainees in the state of Virginia. And I believe I heard that Senator Warner has said the same thing. There are a number of times that Congress has to be involved, and I have a lot of other things which I won't go into to say. The State Department is not elected. They didn't run for office in Montgomery County, nor did they run for office in Fairfax County. We have good people in the State Department, but sometimes they'll have also the unelected and the elected to sit down together. And sometimes you may find the State Department and others who may be a little off base with regard to where the administration is. So I think the more involvement from both sides of the aisle, bipartisan involvement, is very, very good. There have been a number of issues where the Congress has made a difference. In 1975, a Democratic Congress created an entire bureau at state dedicated to the causes of human rights. That was good. Had it not been done, people tell me that had it not been done by the Congress, it would not have been done. In 1998, the International Religious Freedom Commission offered. That was my bill. We passed that. That was good, whereby people and our government reports looked to see not only human rights, but the persecution of people because of their faith. In the year 2000, the Congress voted off the office to monitor and combat sexual trafficking in person. That was good. The State Department wasn't necessarily for that. The administration wasn't necessarily for that. And then in 2004, the Congress passed the office to monitor and combat anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is spreading around the world, and so it was a good thing, not a bad thing. It was a good thing that the Congress took that initiative. I worry a little bit about the administration in the Guantanamo, and also if you see Secretary Rice, Secretary Clinton, failing to really speak out and advocate with regard to human rights and religious freedom with regard to many issues that many members of Congress. So I think it's happening again. It's happening in Guantanamo. This administration is no different than others. They just don't want Congress to be involved. And I think the more Congress is involved in a constructive way with regard to oversight, with regard to meeting and talking and discussing, I think it's better for the country. And with that, I thank you very much for the opportunity to be here.
As I mentioned, they've agreed to remain for, say, another 20 minutes until 4, and so I'm going to give the first prerogative for questions to our two panelists. Karen or Chris, you have anything to ask, either or both?
You want me to go? Okay.
Use the microphone there.
Yeah, I guess I think you're on the same page in terms of the general trend towards aggressiveness on the part of the executive branch. Speculate a little bit on why you think that's the case. I mean, if it's bipartisan, I mean, or nonpartisan, let's say, it's not a function of Republican or Democratic administrations. A point I agree with. Certainly, the Clinton administration was very aggressive. I guess we don't yet quite know about the Obama administration, but there's kind of evidence on both sides. What are the roots of that, and how do you get Congress to respond? Except in a kind of piecemeal way, which I agree is useful and frequently productive and frequently not productive. But you know, how do you get back at that?
Is this on? Okay. I think it's probably too early to say what strategy exactly the administration will take with respect to Congress on foreign policy issues. I mean, every administration, as we have said, Republican and Democrat, takes the view that we don't want Congress complicating our lives, and it's up to Congress through its various devices to try and push back, and we will push back. But I think it's too early on the big issues, for example, Afghanistan and Pakistan. I mean, so far I think that the President and his administration has been very engaged with the Congress in terms of trying to work out their policy. There was a lot of consultation in putting together their strategy going forward. We've just had the supplemental appropriations bill that contains funding, obviously, for Iraq and Afghanistan. The issues where we've had this confrontation so far are really the ones we discussed that relate to the policy of dealing with detainees and the Guantanamo situation. And that has been the product of the fact that the President early on announced his determination to close Guantanamo. It was a commitment he made during the campaign. But it is clear that they made that decision and announced the closure before they released a plan to Congress on exactly how they were going to do it, which has raised some legitimate questions, and Frank raised a lot of those questions. And I think that the best way for Congress to deal with them is, as Congressman Wolf said, to insist on getting the information that's relevant to making these decisions. I do think there is not with respect to Mr. Wolf's intentions here, but I do think there's this element here of trying to whip up, some demagoguery, this notion that we would never have somebody who's accused of a terrorist act on U.S. soil, or that we would require, for example, the governor and the state legislature to approve of that before the executive branch could bring somebody here, I think is inconsistent with previous situations. I mean, we have brought to trial people who've been involved in terrorism on U.S. soil, and we've done it in a way that protects the American people. So I don't think we should automatically say we're never going to bring any of these individuals to the United States, or that we're going to give state legislatures and state governors a say-so over that. However, I do think it's perfectly appropriate to ask the administration to come up with a comprehensive plan on how they're going to approach this before we appropriate monies for those purposes.
The answer to the question is I don't really know the answer. Some of the best ideas I've gotten have been people who have come to me with ideas. Some of my best supporters are people who opposed me when I was first running for office. I think there have been some models. I think the Reagan administration did a very good job. I think at the beginning for the Clinton administration up through, that I can recall, up through the mid-90s, 96, and I did a very good job. You very seldom had a difficult time talking to them, getting them on the phone. They were open. it doesn't mean that you necessarily agree with one another. It's just listening and seeing, and there may be a better idea. And I think the problem that, Chris, to Chris's credit, he alluded to it, the problem that the Democratic Party is currently going to have is they won't want to have any oversights. In the Appropriations Committee, the amendment that I offered was pretty much adopted, but for one thing. But they just didn't want to have a Republican say it because they wanted to kind of control the agenda. Well, when that happens, as Chris said, from 2000 to 2006, the Republican Party didn't hold as much oversight that it should have had on the war. I mean, how can you defend that they shouldn't have had more of an oversight? They should have. And so I think the biggest problem that the party that's in power may have with the House and the Senate and their party is in power with regard to the presidency is not wanting to be tough and aggressive. If you look in the congressional record, I have statements in there criticizing the Bush administration and Secretary Rice with regard to the policy on human rights and religious freedom. Well, if I just said, well, you know, Secretary Rice was a Republican administration, I'm not going to say anything, or Iraq isn't going very well, but it's a Republican administration, so I'm not going to do the Iraq study group, I don't think you accomplish very, very much. I think you have to be very aggressive and very tough, but very fair. No congressional committee, Republican or Democrat, or no member of Congress ought to bully any outside witness, any administration. But to sit down and talk about and try to impact on issues that you care about and have some expertise. And I think Chris is right. The problem is going to be right now, members of the Democratic Party want to say nothing bad at all in any way with regard to the administration. And I think it's to their advantage. It's like when you go to a doctor and it's a health care problem. You don't want them to say, yeah, you have good, that's a nice tie you have, and I like the way you part your hair. What's the real problem, doc? Because by honesty and openness, particularly from friends, it's some of the best way to protect any administration that's in power.
I think Congressman Wolf has suggested some ways that you can be effective. Dogged persistence, which he has, I think, epitomized in some of the examples he's given and what we know of. Bipartisanship, working with members across the aisle, and then also using the purse strings. And those seem to be the most effective. But Karen, do you have a question for either or both of them?
I just wanted to follow up on the Guantanamo thing and where to put the detainees. When the administration announced in January that it was going to start trying to determine what to do with these people preparatory to closing Guantanamo, they set a deadline of 180 days, which would be the middle of July. Since then, obviously we haven't gotten to that point yet, but already a lot of people are coming out saying not here, not here. I wonder if this dynamic of Congress saying you got to tell us right now because we're getting pressure from people in our constituencies saying not here, does that unnecessarily skew the process? Since nobody complained at the beginning about the 180 days, and they said this is how long we're going to take to come up with some kind of policy on that, by pushing them to give you answers right now, do you somehow skew the process, or should they have to be responsive and not be able to set their own deadlines and essentially make a policy without any congressional input?
Go ahead.
Okay.
I'll go second.
Well, if you happen to be on a committee, and this is part of the responsibility of the committee, to ask questions early is not bad. We had a hard time meeting with Eric Holder's team. When we did meet with them, then we were led to believe that something was coming down on the Uyghurs the next week, and it was a Friday afternoon, and we got a call from several people. I think Chris is in the same circumstances that I am. Many of the people who are in the government live in our congressional districts, and they call, and they may work at the Justice Department or at the CIA or at the Department of Homeland Security. And we were led to believe, and there was some verification, that they were going to move them that Friday afternoon. Administrations love to do things on a Friday afternoon when no one's around. When the Congress is gone, the press is gone, and no one's around. And so we had to ask for that. We just had to say, we never asked the FBI, should we or should we not move them? We said, tell us, were they part of Abdul Haq's group? Were they part of the Eastern Turkestan Islamic movement? Were they arrested in Tora Bora? Did they go through al-Qaeda training camps? Was there any information? And then we later got a video sent to me that are these people the same people in the video? So we wanted to know before Eric Holder could do it on some Friday afternoon when everyone was heading to the beach and out of town, and no one would be able to come back to say anything. So I think Congress had a responsibility. I didn't feel like I worked for the Bush administration, and I don't feel like I work for the Obama administration. I work for the people that live in my congressional district. And I think the Bush administration and the Congress should have done more on oversight on Iraq. That's what led me to do the Iraq Study Group. And I think in this issue, the Congress ought to do a lot of oversight. So I think you have a responsibility to ask these questions.
Just to supplement that, a couple points. Number one is I said earlier I think that the oversight process totally broke down between 2000 and 2006, and I hope that the Democrats, even though we have majority control in the House with the Democratic president, will learn from those mistakes, and that and I think we will. We're going to be determined to do that. With respect to this issue, I think that what I think will be the final result after the House and the Senate act on the supplemental will be the right result, which will be we will require by October 1st a report from the administration with respect to what their plan is for handling the detainees at Guantanamo, which I think is a reasonable request on behalf of the Congress, given the fact that the White House announced its policy, but we do not yet have the details going forward. So I think we found our way to a position that I think is responsible and reasonable. As I said, I think that the proposal to say that you're going to essentially hand over the decision making on this issue to governors and state legislatures is an abrogation of federal responsibility, both executive and congressional, to the states, which I don't think is the way to run a foreign policy.
Let me do one quick question. You made passing reference, Congressman Wolf, to the fact that you think Secretary of State Clinton is not speaking out on human rights issues, quite a reversal from, I guess, what we heard during the campaign from both the candidate Obama and Clinton. What role, if any, can Congress play in this? Should it play any role in highlighting the human rights let's say, protests that you've raised before with China, or how is this going to play out exactly? I think that the administration sees a lot of ways that China can help us on various issues, and that's probably why they are not publicly speaking out. But do you think Congress should play any role in this? I know in the past Nancy Pelosi and Chris Smith, for instance, had taken the lead on a lot of these issues. I don't know where things are going now, but would you like to say anything on that?
When I heard that Secretary Clinton, then Senator Clinton, was being appointed to the Secretary of State, I was very pleased because she had in the Senate a very good record on human rights and religious freedom. Since that time, in the Washington Post editorial 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, was very, very critical of her, saying that she had not really done. She went to China and never aggressively spoke out. She may have said something privately, off the record, with nobody around. But it's kind of like in politics. If somebody in Montgomery County says privately, Chris, I'm really for you, but I just don't want to say it publicly, Chris would say, well, if you really can't be for me publicly, maybe you're not really for me. And so I think when the Secretary of State goes, it's the same way that Ronald Reagan would advocate and speak out on behalf of people publicly. And we have seen a backtracking with regard to China. In China today, there are 30 Catholic priests in jail. In China today, there are a large number of house church leaders that are in jail. In China today, and I went to Tibet in 1997, went in with a trekking group. They're persecuting Tibetan monks and nuns. Lhasa is no longer truly a Tibetan city. It's been dramatically changed. They've bulldozed large portions. They're persecuting the Muslims, the Uyghurs, up in that northwest portion of the country. Talk to Reba Gadir and see what they're doing to her and to her children. They have cyber attacks against us. There's so many other things. And the president is ready to go to Cairo next week or the week after, and he ought to be advocating, speaking out. If you recall, the Bush administration for the first 4 years advocated on behalf of the Coptic Christians, advocated on behalf of freedom and democracy, advocated on the behalf of Baha'is. And yet the last time Secretary Rice went to Cairo, I don't know that Ayman Noor's case ever came up. So I think to date, Secretary Clinton has been a disappointment. Hopefully she'll get her voice and speak out, and when the president goes to Cairo, he'll advocate publicly for the Coptic Christians, advocate publicly for the Baha'is, advocate publicly for the Ayman Noors and people like that, for democracy. That way, I think it makes all the difference in the world. We have given Mubarak $50 billion since the Camp David peace accords. And if you're a Coptic Christian in Cairo or a member of the Baha'i, if you're a Baha'i faith, you can't even get a driver's license. You have nothing. You are no one. You're not even recognized. So I think we ought to always be speaking out for human rights, religious freedom, and advocate for the way that Ronald Reagan did very, very well, and the way that the Democratic administrations have done very well. But to date, the Secretary has and has not.
Yeah, if I could comment on that as well. And of course, Woodrow Wilson, we're in the Woodrow Wilson Center, was somebody who advocated strongly on behalf of universal human rights. And I think it's been an important part of the American foreign policy tradition on a bipartisan basis. And I think this administration will continue to be a strong voice for human rights and for democracy promotion. I think what you're seeing is the fact that a lot of damage has to be repaired because what has happened over the last 6 years has unfortunately, I think, created a perception in the view of many people that the United States has been hypocritical in terms of its approach to these issues. We may talk about human rights, but then people see the photographs from Abu Ghraib. We may talk about democracy promotion, but then sometimes we promote it when it's convenient, and sometimes we don't promote it when it's not convenient. And unfortunately, the Bush democracy promotion mantra became seen in many parts of the world, not as a promotion of democracy, but simply as a promotion of the Bush agenda. I mean, for example, the rationales for going into Iraq evolved over a period of time. First it was weapons of mass destruction, then it was the argument that al-Qaeda was somehow operating out of Iraq, things that proved not to be true. But the other part of their argument was we want to go in there and by force of arms bring democracy to Iraq. And that particular approach obviously created lots of, a strong response in the Arab world and parts of the Muslim world. And so I think one of the things this administration has had to do is to begin to repair that damage. And I think that's what the president's been trying to be doing by reaching out and trying to engage in a conversation with the Muslim world, with trying to go to Cairo. Now, I hope, as Frank said, I hope that when the president's in Cairo, he does speak out on these issues, and he talks about the importance of democracy. Frank mentioned the Coptic Christians and human rights. That's a very important issue. The other issue, of course, in Egypt is that you've got when you're not allowed to have viewpoints that are different than the regimes express themselves through the political process, then sometimes they see their only alternative avenue of expression is through engaging in terrorism and other things. And so trying to promote democracy in Egypt and other parts of the world, I think, is an important part of our foreign policy. But in order to do that in a credible way, I think we have a lot of damage repair work to be done.
If I could just, I don't want to get in a debate with Chris, but if I can just say, the Washington Post editorial was a very good editorial. I put it in the Congressional Record. It was such a good editorial. And quite frankly, the administration has not done a very good job dealing with the issue of Darfur. I thought Darfur would have been one of the first places that they had a special envoy. I congratulate him. Mitchell's a great special envoy, and Holbrooke is too. But the same merit should have been given also to Darfur. That genocide, and it is genocide, has been going on for 5 years. And the Bush administration spoke out adequately. They were criticized by many in Congress. And I thought that this administration would do more. And quite frankly, the special envoy was appointed some afternoon in some auditorium, some far away where nobody even picked it. And members of the Congress, Democratic members on the committee, didn't even know who the person was and how they had been appointed. So Darfur, they have not covered themselves very well there.
I think we have time for a couple of questions from the audience. Wait for a microphone. Let's try Monty Tripp on the aisle there in the red.
Thank you. Given the administration's reluctance to assist Congress with oversight and Congress's concerns about public perceptions on foreign travel, how are you effectively doing your job these days, and who are the young members that are really stepping up to take an aggressive role?
Well, I haven't found it to be, I mean, there have been stories criticizing members. When I go on a trip, I report the trip that I've taken, and, you know, sometimes people will like it and sometimes they won't. Sometimes people say, I don't think you should be spending so much time on the issue of the genocide in Darfur. You should be more time on transportation. I get that criticism sometimes, but overall, I think if a member wants to travel on the current restrictions, I think they're perfectly appropriate, and I think you ought not travel any place you're not willing to publicly say, I've gone to this place, and this is what I'm doing, and this is why I'm doing. So I don't think there's really been that much of a restriction. Any member who wants to go, if you want to go to Rhodesia for the 4th of July, if you want to go to Zimbabwe, if you want, you can pretty much go. So I don't think the restrictions have been very much. I think members can pretty much travel where they want to, knowing full well that they'll have to publicize where they have gone and hopefully put out a trip report on it so people will know what they've done. And knowing that you may very well, somebody might say to Chris, well, Chris, I don't know why you went to South Africa when you should have been fixing the I-95 heading up north. But that sometimes comes with it, but yet you try to do all things together, and sometimes you please people, sometimes you don't.
Let me just add, I hadn't understood completely your question, but I gathered, I think I understood it from Frank's.
Are younger members more reluctant to travel?
Is it the criticism
Yeah,
piece?
members are so reluctant to travel these days because they're so afraid of public criticism of particularly international trips.
Right. As Frank said, this is something you've got to be willing to go out and address it head on with your constituents and explain the importance of foreign travel. I mean, I agree with him that you have to have the transparency and reporting in terms of your travel. I also agree, having been a Foreign Service brat and grown up many places around the world, that it's very important for people who are dealing with these foreign policy issues to travel, and it's important that members of Congress take these trips to try and see for themselves what's happening. That having been said, I think it's also important to understand that when you go to these places, you should do your best to try and get as many different points of view as possible. Frank talked about how the administrations tried to limit access to certain places, and sometimes there is a tendency on behalf of any administration to just want to tell members of Congress the party line. And so I do think these trips are much more valuable if members of Congress not only go on the beaten path, but try and talk to others that whatever administration it may be would rather they not hear.
Other questions? Young man here on the aisle, or second from the aisle? Yes. Identify yourself, please.
My name is Taha Gai. I'm with the Pakistani American Leadership Center. Representative Van Hollen, thank you for your leadership on the Reconstruction Opportunity Zones. And that brings me to my question, which is, oftentimes, do you find that in Congress, because there are certain things that might forward the national security interest or a generalized national interest, but then might cause adverse effects within a certain member's district, because there's concentrated negative effects in a certain member's district, then they have almost more power or more reason to oppose something, whereas when the benefits are dispersed over the whole nation, then it might not move forward in that case. And then my second question is, are there cases where, I think, obviously Congress has the appropriations power, but if they get too involved in the management of how that money is appropriated, do you think to a certain extent the administration is more able to react quickly to events happening on the ground, whereas because the legislative process is generally slower, they are unable to react to those changes on the ground in terms of appropriations or directing how that money is spent?
Sure. With respect to your first question, yes. I mean, there are multiple examples of how the negative effects of a particular policy can be very severely felt in one particular location, which of course leads that member of Congress in representing his or her constituents to be perhaps outspoken against a policy where the benefits are more diffuse. And I'll give you, trade policy can be an example of that. And the ROZ bill, which I think we were going to be able to get through, but there are certain issues on the labor side that we're working through. But there's no doubt that, for example, when you have a company moving overseas, say in the aftermath of NAFTA, going from Ohio to Mexico, that the immediate impact in that community in Ohio is hard felt, whereas The benefits of the trade with Mexico or wherever it may be are more diffuse throughout the economy, but there's no doubt that they are benefits because the United States has got, in fact, these days, part of our economic growth may be dependent on expanding our trade. So you're absolutely right that when the benefits are diffuse, it's more difficult because those members of Congress may not be quite as energized as those members from those districts that are being hardest hit. With respect to the purse strings, I mean, you've got to find a balance. I mean, the Congress shouldn't be micromanaging the expenditure of every dollar. But as we said, really our not only, but one of our main devices for influencing foreign policy is through the power of the purse. That is one way you can get the attention of the executive branch, is if you say you're not going to get this money unless there's conditions attached, then you can fight over it. So yes, there are times when Congress probably tries to over micromanage the expenditure of funds. However, understand that it is our major tool, the major tool that we have to try to influence the outcome of foreign policy decisions.
When Congress can move fast as well as an administration can. When you come back from a trip, you don't have to go through the surnaming process. I worked for a cabinet secretary for 5 years. To get a letter out of the department was very tough sometime. If anyone has ever worked in the executive branch, the person may be traveling. I'm sure it's all done now. It isn't, you don't have to sign the left-hand column with your initials, but Congress can move pretty fast. Secondly, there are differences. I would stipulate members who speak out on these issues for both sides care. I have spoken out on the issue of Armenian genocide, yet I have very few Armenians that live in my congressional district. It's probably more likely that Adam Schiff, or I think it's his district out in L.A., has more Armenians, so he feels more intensely about this because when he's home, they're speaking to him. But overall, I think members care about these things for different reasons, whether it be a trip that they took. The 2 trips that I took at the outset that changed my life, both because of Congressman Hall. One to Ethiopia and another to Romania during the dark days of the Ceausescu administration. Trips are important, but members can act based on that, on what they see. But yes, a local thing can move somebody one way or the other, particularly if the Armenian genocide issue or something like it. But overall, I think members pretty much speak out and say what they believe in.
Well, please join me in thanking our 2 members of Congress for being with us here today.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Nice to meet you, Frank. Good to meet you, Chris. Nice to meet you. Thanks for coming. Thank you.
Can we do you next, Chris?
Whatever you want. All right. Yep. Give him a chance to exit.
Yep.
Some boring professor to talk to.
Okay, while some folks are exiting, I'll just mention something that occurred to me when we were talking about micromanaging, and that is I'm still trying to track down the quote, but I'm sure I remember hearing it when Secretary Kissinger was either had just left office, I believe, but he was commenting somewhere about Congress and its role in foreign policy making. He says, well, Congress is a little like 535 ants on a log going down a river, each one thinking they're steering. And that's how he felt about Congress trying to make foreign policy. But then when I was trying to track that down again recently, I ran across a very similar quote, and it turned out he was paraphrasing something Mark Twain, I believe, had once said about a bureaucracy, the same thing. Each bureaucrat thinks that they're steering that log that's floating down the river. But in any event, let's get into the second part of our program with Chris Deering and Karen DeYoung. Chris, as you know, is a professor of political science at George Washington University, and he is the co-author of the book Committees in Congress, which is, I think, still an excellent book, so much so that it's, I believe, in its fourth edition. It's used in a lot of college classrooms. He's also editor of the book Congressional Politics, and his areas of specialty include congressional leadership, members' careers, and Congress's role in foreign and national security policy making. We've previously had him here, in fact, on a seminar we did on Congress and war powers. Karen DeYoung will follow him, and she's an associate editor of the Washington Post. She's worked for the paper since 1975, and she's served in a number of foreign posts, including the London bureau chief, foreign editor, and Latin American bureau chief. She's also been assistant managing editor for national news and national editor. So she's observed our government from a variety of perspectives, both at home and abroad, and we did have her here previously as well for one of our seminars. So we're always glad to have folks that are willing to come back and always have something to contribute. So I'm going to start out with Chris Deering. You either can stay at the podium or at the dais, or take the podium, whichever you feel most comfortable with.
I'm going to stay here.
Okay.
I came down with a cold last week, and so from about here up, I'm useless. And if I go into some fit of coughing, then we'll just turn it over to Karen. It reminds me, there's a similar story about Warren Christopher and Cyrus Vance. I don't know if you heard this one,
No.
Don. And I guess Christopher was, Undersecretary of State or something like that, and he was going to Capitol Hill to meet with the congressional foreign policy leadership, and he'd come back, and Vance was in the office, and Vance sort of noted a kind of a blanched look in Christopher's face, as though he'd been surprised somehow in what he'd found on Capitol Hill, and Vance said to Christopher, what's wrong? And he said, well, I thought I was going to go meet with the congressional leadership on foreign policy, and there were 535 people there. And Vance said, well, that is the congressional leadership on foreign policy. That story doesn't do me any good, because I guess my job here is, at least in part, to worry a little bit about why Congress doesn't play a better role in foreign policy. And in other things I've written, and some of which I've put into this paper, and some new stuff in this paper, I try to explain part of that, and I won't do a long dissertation on it, but the short answer in my book is that Congress has given it away, and they've done that pretty repeatedly throughout the 20th century and into the 21st century, mostly by legislating. They've simply made the presidency more powerful. They did it in the 1921 Budget Act. They did it in the 1939 Reorganization Act, Executive Reorganization Act. They did it in the 1964 Trade Act. They did it in subsequent trade acts. They did it in the 1947 National Security Act. And they did it, of course, in the Tonkin Gulf Middle East Resolution, and so on and so forth. In many cases, not so much with the resolutions, but in many cases, the presidents didn't exactly ask for that. I mean, they weren't out stumping for more power. And that was certainly true before World War II, when Congress was a lot more authoritative than it has been since the Cold War. Now, after that, of course, Congress tried its best to get back some of that, and Chris and Frank talked a little bit about that. But the problem is, of course, that in the bipartisan period that existed at the nadir of partisanship, basically 1972, during the Nixon administration, Republicans and Democrats could cross the aisle. Yeah, it was more bipartisan, but part of that, of course, was because you had all these Southern Democrats, which we've gotten rid of, and that stuff's all kind of neatened itself up, and so there was less polarized politics during that particular time period, and it's increased like this since then. If you look at the table, so it's a nice picture of polarization in Congress in the paper from the beginning of the 20th century, up till just about today. So let me talk a little bit about why that's the case. Don wants us to talk for 15 minutes. I'm an academic. I can talk for 2 or 3 hours or 2 or 3 weeks, and I don't even have PowerPoints with me today.
I discouraged it.
And I willingly agreed. But let me sketch out some of the arguments in the paper. I'll skip over some. It's essentially got 6 parts. So the first part is in response to a question that Don asked when we agreed that I would do this. And it's fairly prosaic, but that is, what are the conditions that promote or impede congressional responsibility in foreign policy? And I think there's 4. And you're not going to be surprised about them. It's crisis politics, it's bipartisanship, it's divided government, it's polarized politics. Now, any three of those can exist at the same point in time. You can't really have bipartisanship and polarized politics at the same point in time. But I'm an academic. I could argue that point if you really wanted me to. The important point is that crisis politics obviously redound to the advantage of the president because there's these rally effects that we're all widely familiar with, particularly during wartime crises. Now, as wars go on, this is the casualty hypothesis, public opinion tends to shift, and members of Congress, evidence before you, or was before you, begin to change their minds on these things as public opinion builds up and they become more responsive to those kinds of things. Bipartisanship obviously can be useful, but it depends a little bit on whether you've got divided government or not. All right? And I'm not going to play all these scenarios out for you. But bipartisanship has obviously been highly consequential early in the Cold War, when the president was getting substantial support, not universal support, but substantial support during the early days of the Cold War. And it was also highly important, but in a period of divided government in the Nixon administration, and of course at that point they were all out to get Nixon's head. They did. So divided party government is a variable in that. Now, throughout American history, that hasn't been very consequential, because not until 1969 has bipartisanship been more common than less common. And I don't have the figures in front of me, but they're pretty remarkable, actually, if you go like just before 1969. Excuse me. There's almost always a little lag lead when you had party shifts. So Congress might have tipped before the presidency did, but they were usually pretty closely tied together. And you have periods of republicanism, periods of democratism, and so forth. But divided government's a real new variable in here. And then the fourth one, again, is polarized partisanship. These guys are pretty polite. They have to deal with each other a lot. But you could see it in what they had to say. They've got different points of view on a lot of these things. It's very difficult to get over that during this day and age. That's kind of a separate topic, but it plays in foreign policy as well. The relative safety of members, the permanent campaign. Chris is the head of the campaign committee for the Democrats. If he's going to get criticized, he's going to get criticized for going on trips around the United States, not for going to Pakistan, and how much time he spends on that instead of I-95. Well, he doesn't really have I-95, does he? Never mind. The second part of this is, what are the presidents going to do? And there's kind of three possibilities here, and it would take me too long to sketch these out. But let's think about one model, which is the ultra-Whig model. And the ultra-Whig model you can think of as James Madison, right? And Madison, of course, writes the Constitution, but he had a lot of respect, by and large, Don's evidence to the contrary notwithstanding, for the Congress and its role, because he had written the darn Constitution to begin with. He was against a large standing army. He was, by today's standards, very conservative, right? Today you'd call him a Republican, except for the standing army business. But he and Jefferson were both against a large standing army. Today you've got two kinds of possibilities. The expansionist approach, which I think is captured certainly by Dick Cheney, if not by George W. Bush, and to a certain extent by Clinton and others. Most contemporary presidents, and by contemporary I'll sort of say like Nixon onward, maybe with Carter as an exception, were very expansionist in their views of the office. This is, now the Congress is giving them power, but they really want the damn power, right? They're cool with this. And then when Congress says, well, maybe we can't have it, and they say, no, we're going to take it anyway, right? So they become much more aggressive in that regard. And the other alternative is what I call a mixed cooperative approach. Now, Obama's administration has been, at least rhetorically, more towards this kind of mixed cooperative approach. More cooperation with Congress, more information for Congress, more multilateralism, and a variety of things that sort of fill into that, into that mode. But we don't know exactly what Obama's going to do. And the members, suggested evidence on both sides of that equation. Both of them did. So it's not just Frank's interpretation or Chris's interpretation. I think it's, they're not quite sure yet either. There's a quote in the paper from Cheney, who, of course, worked in the Ford administration, and I think Ford was the one who first rhetorically kind of went down this road of worrying about Congress's over balancing and its intrusions into foreign policy. More so than I've done a little bit of history on this, and I can't think of any. But Ford was really out there on this. Maybe Cheney was behind it even then. Third part of the paper is about tools. Chris talked all about those. I don't need to talk about them. Authorizations, appropriations, tariff, tax, appointments, treaties, oversight, and so forth. So let me try to wrap up here by making two of the last 3 points. And the first is, what are the legislative facts of life? Well, as I see them, and these go beyond foreign policy, but they're particularly true in foreign policy, there's 5. One is institutional stickiness, a political science-y kind of term, although it's a little gooey. And institutional stickiness is basically an org theorist's way of saying, once you adopt a rule or a procedure or a structure, it's kind of hard to get rid of. So this is the argument that, it's difficult. Bureaucracies never die, right? You're not going to get rid of the filibuster. The Senate is not going to suddenly say, the filibuster is kind of counterproductive. Let's get rid of it, right? We're going to become more like the House. Not going to happen. You can get rid of some institutions, particularly if they're not too old. So, for example, the Democrats did abandon term limits for chairs. A not inconsequential change, when you think about it. The Republicans weren't going to do that, that's for sure, even though some of them were getting a little leery of it. Second thing is turf consciousness. And this plays across the board, but again, it plays particularly in foreign policy, and that is that you've got 4 or 5 committees and numerous subcommittees, all of whom are jockeying for and desperate to keep their legislative jurisdictional turf where foreign and defense policy are concerned. Don't step on my turf. It's all about turf. This is hamstrung the initial creation of the Homeland Security Committees, for example, where in the Senate you've grafted it onto a pre-existing committee. In the House they created a freestanding committee. But in both cases they've been finding it very, very difficult to carve out a space for themselves and to do adequate oversight on these kinds of things. Now, multiple committees doing oversight is a good thing because some can be dysfunctional at any one point in time, and so that kind of overlap, I think, is probably okay. The third thing is stare decisis, and this is really more of a judicial argument. Up until certainly the Civil War, most of the Supreme Court's decisions about Congress and foreign policy redounded to the Congress's advantage. They said that in Little versus Bream, for example, that President Adams, it would have been, that President Adams had no right to interdict, to capture a French ship coming from France to the United States because Congress had only given the President the authority to do so on the way out. But he said, well, if I can do it out, I can do it in, right? Court said, no, you can't, because that's not what the law says. And there are other examples like this. The most important case here, of course, is U.S. versus Curtis Wright. I'll show my colors. It's probably one of the worst Supreme Court decisions ever made. Constitutional scholars have been criticizing it for the better part of 100 years. But it's a very expansive decision that is the most cited case in foreign policy terms, maybe with Gibbons versus Ogden or something like that. And so that's, pretty highly consequential. Last 2 things, legacy programs. What are you going to do after you've bought 150 some odd F-22s? And then you say, we'll stop at 187. I'm guessing they're not going to stop, right? Legacy programs are very difficult for Congress, particularly for pork barrel reasons. It's just darned hard to stop a program. So we keep buying and we keep buying and we keep buying. But that's, of course, troublesome from the defense budget standpoint. V-22 tilt rotors is a similar kind of circumstance, and we've had other examples historically. It gets in the way of buying the newer things, and it keeps us buying things that we don't necessarily need. So that's a harmful element to how Congress operates. And then again, polarized politics. So in conclusion, I hope I haven't gone on too long, but I never looked at a watch. Congress has 3 choices, I think. One was advocated by the now recently deceased Sam Huntington, who's been in and out of various administrations, and that was, he said they ought to abdicate. And Huntington argued that we basically, and Clark Clifford was on this same page at least for a while, Sam Huntington basically said, we ought to become a parliament and just get Congress out of this business entirely. I'm too much of a Congress scholar to argue that normatively, and I don't think empirically we're going to go there either. But there have been times when Congress was taking such a back seat that it was almost like they had said, you know, the heck with it, we're just going to abdicate. Second possibility is that they're going to legislate aggressively, but I think that the members have given us more than enough evidence to indicate that that's not very likely. You'll notice that they kept coming back to oversight, to oversight, to oversight, and that oversight was always pretty fragmented, pretty highly personalized, because they have personal interests and cares and concerns. That's fine, but unless you can translate oversight into legislation, then you've got kind of problems. And if you're going to use the deus ex machina of appropriations as your only tool, then you still have problems of coherence, which the gentleman who's not here now kind of asked about. So the final possibility is the one that they're most likely to engage in, and that's, I'm afraid, tinkering at this point. The party polarization is too great to get them to agree on clear foreign policy kinds of legislation, I think. And to the extent that we have foreign policy legislation, I think it's likely, at least during these first few years, to be mostly kind of what does Obama want. And then they'll play with it a little bit, but that's my tinkering strategy. Okay. None of this pleases me. Again, as a Congress scholar, I would like Congress to play a much more forceful role in foreign policy. I think they ought to. I think the Constitution says they should. I think the founders were quite clear on these points. We can debate those if you want. But I think Congress has, to some degree, turned its back on those things, particularly in the last 40 years or so.
Thank you very much, Chris. Karen?
I'm going to stand up.
Sure. And there's another bottle of water hiding under the podium there if you would like it.
I'm actually going to stand up because I can't see my notes if I have them on the table in front of me. I sort of feel like we waited until the Congress guys left with their complaints about how the president doesn't let them do anything to kind of complain about Congress, how one of the reasons they don't do anything is because they don't do anything.
We'll give them a copy of this tape.
So I'm going to read you. We've quoted a lot from Lee Hamilton, who's someone whose views are both well known and widely respected on this topic. And most of the quotes have been about how Lee Hamilton felt like the president should consult more with Congress. But I'm going to read you a different quote from his. He says, and he said this about, I think, 11 or 12 years ago, "I believe that the Congress should have and does have a constitutional responsibility to play a central role in the formulation and development, but not the implementation of American foreign policy. I believe that a partnership between the President and the Congress that is characterized by a creative tension produces a foreign policy that better reflects the American national interests and the values of the American people." And he went on then to accuse Congress of acting what he said was erratically in foreign policy. "It is often engaged primarily for political reasons, displaying little sophistication about very complex and difficult problems." Of course, he then went on and said that he'd served with 7 presidents when he was in the Congress, and not a single one of them has consulted enough with Congress on important questions of American policy. The result is that every president has experienced deep trouble or failure at some point from an inability to convince Congress of the merits of his policies. But I think that, again, what to me is the most important part of that is his criticism of Congress itself for not being well enough informed. And I think any of you who have been to a lot of hearings on foreign policy would agree with that. Now, this is not to say there are some very well-informed members, but there are a lot who are not, and many more who belong to committees and don't bother to show up to ask questions at their own committee hearings. It's obviously good that Congress has a voice in foreign policy. It's not only good, as we've heard, it's in the Constitution. But Congress is us, the distracted special interests, special pleading, non-expert body that often doesn't pay enough attention or attention to the right things and has vested interests in certain policies that often have little to do with the merits of those policies. And of course the president should consult and listen to Congress. That's in the Constitution too, even if he usually doesn't. We've had a lot of people here who are much more intricately informed of the law and how it works than I am. So I thought I'd just touch briefly on how it works in practice, at least from the perspective of a journalist. And I want to use an example of the congressional imposition of benchmarks to delineate progress in the Bush administration's policies on Iraq. This particular story begins in about January of 2007, when President Bush announced his surge policy, the decision to send tens of thousands of additional troops to Iraq. More troops, he said, would provide more security to give Iraqi politics some breathing space, remember that term? Enabling them to proceed with provincial elections and pass a raft of power-sharing legislation. In addition, he said, the government of Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki planned to take responsibilities for security in all of Iraq's provinces by November, and that again was November of 2007. Up to that point, Bush had had a relatively free rein in Iraq. The Republican-led Congress appropriated several years of supplemental appropriations to fund the war. But by the time Bush had made that announcement, the Democrats had taken over in Congress, in large part due to opposition to Bush's war policies. And Congress was moving quickly up to where the American public had already arrived, as Chris told us. They are a kind of lagging indicator, in turning against the war and losing whatever remaining faith it had in the Maliki government. Bush had already vetoed a bill, as we heard earlier, calling for a timetable for redeployment of troops out of Iraq. In May of 2007, the House Democrats decided to use the power of the purse, saying they would give Bush only half of the $95 billion he had then requested in supplemental appropriations for the war for the rest of that fiscal year. And they were going to keep the rest until the Iraqi government followed through with some of the promises Bush had made several months earlier, passed laws on political reconstruction and reconciliation, revised the Iraqi constitution, passed laws on distributing its oil income more equitably, and until they produced evidence that the Iraqi military was becoming capable of taking over its own war. The bill set two deadlines, one for late July, remember this was in May, for late July for an interim report, and the other for September when Congress would make a final decision on this other half of the supplemental appropriation. And the White House was furious. The Democratic proposal, which in fact a number of Republicans actually supported by that point, were dangerous. They were, as one White House official said, a moral hazard that would encourage al-Qaeda and others to simply wait out the deadline. Administration officials said they were already putting a lot of pressure on Maliki. They were pushing for reforms, but mandating them by a certain date would drive the Iraqis further apart, not bring them closer together, and would allow extremists to label that agenda an American one and not an Iraqi one. Administration said there'd be a new wave of suicide attacks and violence would go up. In its interim report that July on the benchmarks, the administration managed basically to punt and kind of sailed through with vague reports of legislative progress. In the summer, things got visibly worse rather than better in Iraq, drawing a lot of Republicans in Congress, if not into outright opposition, at least to skepticism. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, who just months earlier had led the charge against a non-binding resolution, again, which we heard discussed earlier, opposing the troop surge, predicted that the administration would be forced to change course by that fall. Congressional anger, Democratic and Republican, focused on the seemingly inept and sectarian Iraqi government and the administration's continued support for it. In fact, Iraqi politicians were further than ever from reconciliation. Sunni leaders had withdrawn from Maliki's Shiite government, and no legislation had been passed at all. It looked as if Congress was finally going to have the upper hand in Iraq policy, again, somewhat behind where the American public was at that point. But the White House had a different strategy. As it became clear that the Iraqi government was not likely to meet any of the 18 benchmarks that Congress had set for it to meet by that September, the White House began subtly changing the goalposts. Instead of reporting on the passage of laws in progress by Iraqi security forces, as outlined by the benchmarks, it would report on other things, that Sunni tribal leaders in Anbar province were turning against al-Qaeda, that the actual number of sectarian killings, having reached a high in about July, I believe, of that year, had actually started going down. To give some breathing space to his own party in Congress, Bush held a news conference, and he made the case that progress was underway and that any demands for a dramatic shift in strategy should wait until September. This was in July. His goal was the same as theirs, Bush said of Congress. And then he proceeded to state a different goal altogether. We're working to defeat al-Qaeda and other extremists in Iraq, which of course had been his stated goal all along, but again was not in any of the benchmarks. Bush acknowledged that there was a lot of public anxiety over the war, but he lashed out at Democrats in Congress for trying to end the war from Capitol Hill. I'll listen to Congress, Bush said, but the idea of telling our military how to conduct operations or how to deal with troop strength, I don't think that makes sense. His strategy didn't work very well. I'm disappointed, said John Warner, Republican from Virginia. The Maliki government, he said, is simply not providing leadership worthy of the considerable sacrifice of our forces, and this has to change immediately. Democrats were even more scathing. They accused Bush of whitewashing the findings and failing to face reality. Nancy Pelosi said the president stubbornly refuses to develop a redeployment strategy or devise a redeployment schedule, preferring to hope, despite the abundance of evidence to the contrary, that his failed policies will somehow make tomorrow better than today. Well, fortunately for Bush and for members of Congress who, I think, including the Democrats, who were not prepared to do what they had promised to do, some parts of the strategy actually did begin to work, although not those associated with the benchmarks. By the time General Petraeus and Ambassador Crocker testified before Congress in September of that year, they reported a fairly sharp drop, at least for the previous 6 to 8 weeks before their testimony, in levels of violence, even though they couldn't certify any Iraqi political progress at all. But everyone by that point seemed to have forgotten completely about the benchmarks that had been Congress's obsession just a few months earlier. So did congressional intervention in that situation have any real effect? I would maintain actually that it did. It forced the administration to explain itself. It forced it to do it in public. And more important, it moved the administration towards starting to think of a way out of Iraq. When Congress set the benchmarks in the spring of 2007, they only thought forward to September, the end of the fiscal year, and the supplemental appropriation. After September, they didn't have any strategy. If the administration didn't meet them, the regular budget would go into effect. But by the following January of 2008, the administration had a new mantra altogether: Iraqi solutions for Iraqi problems. Let the Iraqis figure it out while we figure out how to leave. Some people called it realism, but a lot of people inside the administration acknowledged it was desperation. But again, I think Congress did have an effect of pushing the administration in a direction, even though the actual mandates that they imposed didn't accomplish much of anything. So jump ahead to this April. The Obama administration has decided to vastly increase U.S. aid to Pakistan, arguing that that's the central front in the U.S. struggle against al-Qaeda. Congress, again, is uneasy and distrustful, perhaps remembering some of the lessons of Iraq, no matter how much a lot of people like President Obama. Congress wants some control over the policy. A bill was introduced in the House that imposed 13 separate benchmarks that had to be met before the flow of money to Pakistan would start. Obama promised no blank check, but he warned, in a very similar way that Bush did about Iraq, that the United States had to, quote, demonstrate through deeds as well as words a commitment that is enduring. He warned that Pakistan's government and people would take it amiss if the United States tried to dictate too much. And it would be looked at as an American policy and not a Pakistan policy. So whatever vague benchmarks really end up being set for Pakistan, it's likely that the administration will have its way, as we've heard administrations almost always do, where foreign policy is concerned. Congressional efforts to keep a rein on the president's exercise of foreign policy are inept, sometimes irrational, impatient, and driven by politics and crisis. And I commend Chris's paper to you, the part about crisis legislation and crisis decision-making in Congress on foreign policy. Congress has a short attention span, and it doesn't like to take responsibility. But on most occasions, although certainly not all, at least it compels the administration in power to come up with an explanation for what it's doing. It may not always be the truth, but it's better than no explanation at all. And I'll close with a story of when I was working in London as the Washington Post correspondent there. I think, like a lot of Americans, I got there and people talked nice, and Parliament seemed so civil. Even when they were arguing and yelling, they seemed civil. And they somehow seemed, I think it was the accent. Yeah, it made them seem like they knew what they were talking about. And the first debate I listened to in Parliament was about nuclear weapons, and these were the days of the campaign for nuclear disarmament and people out in the street. And somebody in the Labour Party got up and asked Margaret Thatcher a very pointed question about their reprocessing facilities, and she gave a pointed answer, as she usually did. And I thought, well, this is something interesting to follow up on. I've got to find stories to do here. And so afterwards, I did what I would have done here, which is to find the member and get their staff to tell me more about this issue and help me out. And so I called up the member, and it was a very nice guy. And I said, wow, you asked this great question today in the Commons, and can you tell me more about it? And he said, oh, well, I don't really know any more about that. There's somebody from Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament just handed me a piece of paper and said, ask this question. And in fact, if you went into the office of a member of the British Parliament, they basically they don't have any staff at all. They have a room that they frequently share with another member. And if they're lucky, they have a secretary between the two of them. I will say their defense committees have gotten a little bit better in recent years, but they're nothing compared to here. And so as a journalist, what you have for Congress, particularly on foreign policy, which is really the only thing I've ever covered here, you do have this alternative center of information, an alternative, I'll call it a power center, where you can go to do what somebody in my position really doesn't have the time or the resources to do. You've got whole staffs of people who do research, who provide information, and who actually say things in public that allow us to ask more questions and demand some answers from the White House. Thank you.
Thank you. One of the things that we did not discuss with the two members when they were here, and yet they figure, I think, in important ways on the Hill, are the informal member caucuses, and these number about 300, and a lot of them are really foreign policy oriented, and I think a lot of that has to do with constituencies of particular ethnic backgrounds. A lot has to do with interest groups, whether they're human rights groups, NGOs of various kinds, and so on. But from time to time, they will be an organizing force on the Hill for certain legislation or certain amendments and so on, and at least I've seen that at work. Have you, either of you, noticed an increase in that activity, the informal member caucuses? A lot of people have said the standing committee system has declined in a lot of ways, but you've still got members very active on a lot of these issues in different ways.
One place where I've noticed it is on Cuba. There was a question earlier when the congressmen were here about whether a member's interest in an issue and the passion that engenders gives them more power on a certain issue, and that certainly was always the case with Cuba, where you had the Cuban American members of Congress who care very, very much and are all on one side of the issue, and cared so much more than anyone else did really about Cuba. that they essentially set policy for it. I mean, in most cases, the administration in power agreed with them. What you've had more recently, though, is a caucus develop of members on the other side of the issue, who have added more and more members as time has gone on, and it's bipartisan, and they actually have become pretty powerful and are, in fact, setting the agenda. And so you see the Obama administration, which I think would like to take certain steps to change the relationship with Cuba, but really doesn't feel too confident of putting itself forward on that issue when it has so many other issues to deal with. I think the Congress, those people who have become part of this growing group that started with this small caucus, have pulled out ahead, and I think actually are setting the agenda now, and probably will pass legislation that the administration will go along with, because it saves them the trouble of being responsible for it, even though it's basically what they want.
Chris, have you noticed any of this kind of activity?
Yeah, I don't think that I don't think we have good systematic evidence on this. I mean, the scholars have done a little bit of work on the so-called LSOs, legislative service organizations. There's a couple of issues here. One is, of course, that they're an overlay of the committee system, and so then you have two potentially competing centers of power, if you will. And then the party has difficulty trying to deal with that as in terms of setting their own agenda. So I don't know. I'm sure you're absolutely right about the Cuba thing. I don't know if more generally the caucuses have been agenda setters per se, since the leadership is so locked into, particularly in the House, so locked into and has the tools to determine what that is going to be. Occasionally, obviously, we know that the broader, bigger caucuses, the Northeast Midwest Coalition, the Congressional Black Caucus, and so forth, CBC is obviously pretty powerful, particularly as it gets bigger and bigger. And so they have to be listened to just because there's a bunch of votes there.
But, you know, it may be that it's precisely for the reason you said, that the agricultural states and other people, and again I go back to the issue of Cuba, have become interested in it. So that has really expanded the group for reasons other than having to do with what the U.S. posture is vis-a-vis Cuba, and that's what's allowed it, this sort of community of interests.
They've had some tendency to be sort of single valence. I mean, they're all one way, and so that was the pressure that the members were talking about, where, you know, you've got some intense constituency in your district and they care deeply about this, and you kind of have to go with them. You don't have a lot of freedom on those things. The interesting phenomenon will be if they become multivalent or two-sided, and then you're really getting some debate that pulls in broader coalitions within the institution. Then, if they're bipartisan, that has potentially at least some promise of creating some movement towards legislation that cuts across party lines. If it's partisan, then it's just reinforcing, and they're just going to line up as R's and D's, and then we don't have any real change. But the interesting shift would be if they're bipartisan, in fact.
And I think the Cuba thing is that you mentioned the agriculture thing, that the person that's taking the lead in the Senate now to really get rid of all of the travel limitations, not just for Cuban Americans, which I think Obama wants to do or has done, and remittances, but to allow any Americans to travel to Cuba, is Byron Dorgan, who is from North or South Dakota, big agricultural state, but he claims that he's got 60 votes to stop a filibuster if he tries to bring that up on the floor, whereas Harry Reid is not all that interested in raising the issue. But I think it's an interesting development. We're seeing public opinion change on this, too, in our relations with Cuba. So Florida is still going to be an important presidential state, but I think that you're seeing a shift among second and third generation Cuban Americans on the whole issue of, you know, how much do we loosen, you know, the current situation.
The recent visit was a CBC thing, right?
Yeah, the Congressional Black Caucus visited Cuba a month or so
trip.
ago, right?
Yeah, but there have been lots and lots of congressional trips down there.
But it shows that they're kind of that issue is broadening in interesting ways.
Yeah.
I wanted to follow up on something that both of you mentioned, and Chris, you indicate the three options of Congress: abdicate, which they do quite often, legislate aggressively, and I think we've only heard one major example of that was brought up by, I believe, Congressman Van Hollen. That's 1986, where Congress really did take the initiative on the embargo for South Africa over the administration's objections and over the veto, in fact. And the third thing you mentioned was tinkering. But what I think Karen brought out was the extent to which Congress can subtly affect foreign policy. Maybe this falls under tinkering, but sort of when it tracks public opinion and it pushes back against the administration and members begin to speak out, I think you're seeing, at least with President Obama already, a willingness to reconsider positions that have been taken before and to even change. And I think part of that is Congress being vocal. Also part of it is how they see public opinion or certain interest groups going. And it's not to say that they're caving or whatever, but it sounds to me like the president is much more open to listening to arguments. Is that the impression that you all get, especially in the foreign policy or even in some of the domestic areas?
Go ahead, Karen.
Yeah, I think that an interesting thing is the Afghanistan-Pakistan policy, where you had the administration say, just wait, we're going to have a whole new strategy and we're going to announce it. And so the president made his announcement, I guess it was the end of March, was it? Where everybody said, this is great, narrowed objectives, sending more troops, sending more civilians. And it really took about a month before people said, well, wait a minute, this isn't really a policy either. This is kind of a place where you want to be, and you still haven't told us how we're going to get there. And I think they have pushed the administration to some extent to be more specific, to be more responsive. And I think the whole Guantanamo thing, which I'll lump into the big counterterrorism policy in general, has shown that they. I think the Obama people came in saying, really with a sense of entitlement, as I guess all new administrations do, but in their case, feeling like they were sort of beloved and no one would challenge the rightness of what they were doing because they were so sure of the wrongness of their predecessor, and that most people agreed with that. I think that they have been taken aback a bit increasingly at objections that have been raised very quickly and quite strongly, and have had to I don't want to say compromise because it hasn't gotten to that point yet, but at least be a bit more responsive than I think they would like in a lot of cases.
And as we heard, the Progressive Caucus in the House, at least, was pushing back and looking already for some kind of an exit strategy or even a general timetable on Afghanistan. And I think that they put their votes where their mouths were when they didn't get what they wanted. And there were 51, I think, Democrats that voted against the supplemental appropriation for Afghanistan and Pakistan. So I think that's an early warning shot right there.
Well, and what Obi did to say, you got a year.
Yeah.
Well, I'll oversimplify here, but what you have is the juxtaposition of the Bush administration, which basically said, we're not going to tell you anything, and we'll tell you later what we're going to do, and the Obama administration, which said, well, we're going to tell you stuff, and then lay out a program which, as you point out, is pretty vague. And they've done this on a number of things, and everybody goes, where's the beef? And so they're constantly being pressed for details, and Congress is actually pretty good at that, particularly if you invite them to do it. They will ask those questions. That's where the staffs come in. I mean, that's what they're there to do, is, put those questions out there.
Well, let's get some questions from the audience. So wait for the microphone, and please give your name and affiliation. We'll start right here.
Yeah, Chia Chen, freelance correspondent. Don't get chance to ask to congressmen. Now I'm asked you too.
We'll pretend.
We'll do roll call.
What's the best way for Congress to get involved in the Israel-Palestine issue? And or it would be good for them to get involved in. Thank you.
Carefully. Well, Congress has been involved in these issues for a very long time. They're enormously complex. They're highly sensitive. They're fraught with peril. I'm being flip, but I mean they are. It's difficult terrain to to deal with. I think both parties, and certainly now the administration, have tried to move gingerly forward on these things. They thought, the Democrats have been critical of the Bush administration and its failure to really move forward on these things. At least it was too little, too late when Bush finally said, "Oh, we're going to have an agreement by the time I leave office," which anybody who's been in Washington, on something far less complicated than that would have known was a pretty silly thing to say politically. So I think Congress is and will continue to play a role on these things. I think they can be a good partner, particularly to the extent that various constituencies bring to bear various points of view that are constructive on how to move on these things. Best I can tell you.
When you say move or gingerly, whatever, the Post reported a letter from, I think, Eric Cantor and Steny Hoyer last week to the administration on Israel, and they happened to not take off the bottom, that it was AIPAC was listed at the bottom. I think it was a letter that was transmitted from them to send that was calling for a balanced approach. I mean, it wasn't anything terribly radical, but they were trying to show bipartisanship in support of a go slow or go careful policy towards the Middle East.
Yeah, I think that's an issue that is fraught with peril for everybody. You don't see big hearings on Capitol Hill where you see a wide range of views on that issue, and I don't think you will in the future. You saw a lot of criticism of Bush for not being involved enough, not using his presidential authority to resolve the issue. You saw Obama on the campaign trail saying, "I will be involved." You see Obama appointing a special envoy. I don't think you've seen one iota of change in policy, and you haven't seen Congress pushing for a major change in policy. So I think it's very, very hard.
Okay.
Karen Hudis, international lawyer. My question is a systemic one about transparency and access to information. Based on issues that I've been dealing with, I would say the single biggest cause of the economic crisis and the difficulty in recovery is lack of access to information, and it's the fourth estate. It's the media. It's the fact that the press is afraid to take the really hard stories. And I'll just give you a little anecdote. It'll just take a half a second. What happened to Elliot Spitzer in New York with his private bank accounts being investigated? This happened to the executive directors of the World Bank. And in retaliation, the United States is now no longer allowed to appoint the president of the World Bank. That's an end of a 66-year gentleman's agreement, and Washington stands set to lose thousands of jobs. The press has refused to take the story.
I don't know anything about that, but I'll go back and ask because I haven't heard anything about it. I'm sure I know there are situations where the media is scared to take something on, certain media organizations where there's a political slant. I've been in this business for many, many years. I've always been at the same newspaper, and whatever I haven't covered that deserved to be covered is basically due to my own ineptness or stupidity, because I have to tell you honestly, nobody has come to me and said, don't cover that, or I don't like the way you wrote that. So I think it's, although I'm sure it happens, but I don't see it happening where I work, and it's never happened to me. So I will go back and ask about that, and send me an email and I'll tell you what they say.
I think she raises a good larger issue too, and that is that the Obama administration has promised more transparency across the board in its administration. I'm wondering if we're already seeing some slippage on that in certain areas, or is it just facing the realities that any administration does, that there are certain considerations that you have to take into account before you put everything out there that they thought maybe they could? Is there any of that so far?
Well, of course, everything they're giving away right now has nothing to do with them. And so for the time being, it's real easy because, Obama can take the high road and say, we're not out to get the previous administration, although his rhetoric is contrary to that sometimes, and pretty pointedly so. So we're going to have to wait a while and see if that continues to be transparent. Now, you go back to the international economic crisis, and, they are putting an awful lot of stuff out there. But I don't know if this is the Lyndon Johnson, we shall overwhelm strategy. We're going to give you so much information you can't possibly get through it all. I hope not, and I'll take them at their word for the time being that it's not, that they really want to be more transparent. That is, rhetorically at least, totally contrary to the Bush administration's approach, because they said, we're not going to tell you anything, we're not going to give you anything, and all the stuff I've read in the press and recent, longer sort of treatments of the Bush administration suggested, say, yeah, we'll give it to you. No, So Congress is going to have to, stand up its hind legs and actually press some of these contempt things, I think. I mean, until they actually press that point. Now, that's where the courts come back in again. Will the courts really back them on these things? They seem not to be always willing to do so. And the court has a cockeyed view of American history, in my view, on that, which earlier courts, did not have. Mm-hmm. That's a big question.
Okay, other questions from the audience?
Thank you. I'm Sharon Kotak, and I have a question about the presidential signing statements. Congress actually never really challenged President Bush on the presidential signing statements. Maybe they felt that he would just have a presidential signing statement on what if they challenged him. But it's my understanding that President Obama has promised to use them less, but not really to do away with them. And do you think that there is a possibility that we will do away with presidential signing statements anytime soon?
Well, the criticism of President Bush was that he'd used the signing statements to say, well, I'm signing this, but basically I don't feel bound by this as law. And what Obama said is, I will use them less, and no signing statement, he says, will conflict with the spirit or the letter of the law. We'll just have to see, number one, if that's the case, and number two, if he doesn't do that, if somebody will call him on it.
Yeah. He put out a memorandum, Obama put out a memorandum on March 9th to all of his department heads and agency heads and said, I will continue to use signing statements, but they will not be used to lay off on enforcing the law because of policy disagreements, but rather we will look at these from the standpoint of what the constitutional duties of the president are, how we interpret the law before we move forward. And so this is what he has said, and I think that is good. He says this will cause a healthy dialogue with the Congress, I believe is how he put it, because A, they're going to try better to get these warning signs up to Congress before they finally pass the law or pass the bill and send it to the president, but B, if you have a signing statement, Congress has got a warning right there that keep an eye on this. Are they going to really implement it? So I think they've always been a good thing rather than doing a lot of things behind the scenes where you haven't done signing statements and yet the president is sending secret signals to his agencies to sort of ignore this one way or another. I think they've been healthy overall, but I think a lot of people think Bush overdid it by maybe having so many, and people kept pointing to the numbers, but I mean, presidents have been doing this since the beginning of the time. So,
yeah, here's the Congress is at fault part of this, and that is, of course, bills get bigger and bigger and bigger and more complex, and so Congress legislates vaguely. And so at some point the courts actually look at these things and they're in a position of saying, well, this is a vague law. Well, they can invalidate it, right? But then at least you've got, at least in some cases, you've got the possibility of the president saying, here's how I'm interpreting this law. And as Don says, well, at least it's an invitation to say, no, that's not what we meant. The notion that the president can sit there and sign a bill and say, as Karen did, that and Bush did this on occasion, that I'm going to sign this, but I'm not going to follow it. I'm sorry, that's just not what Article 2 says. I think the laws be faithfully executed.
Yeah, one of the reasons that the people
courts tend to go along with that.
One of the reasons the people at the administration and this or Bush administration before that gave was that they wanted to influence the courts if this law became challenged at some future point. ordinarily they just look at committee reports from Congress or debates and so on, and why shouldn't the President have his say? So if this does reach the courts, the President could say, well, here's, at the time I signed it, here's how I interpreted that law. So this is the reason that they gave, but I think somebody did an analysis, and very few times has a court ever cited a presidential signing statement as reason for its decision.
Well, the Constitution gave us a veto and the requirement to return with objections.
Mm-hmm. In the back row, I believe your hand was up. No? Anybody else? Well, we are right at a little after 5 o'clock. Please thank our panelists and join us for the reception.